It was the winter of 1901. Snow covered the gardens of the royal palace while silence settled over its ancient walls. Servants moved quietly through long candlelit corridors because everyone inside the palace knew the queen was dying. Doctors had done everything they could. Members of the royal household waited outside her private chamber. No one knew how many hours she had left. Among the servants was a 19-year-old maid named Elizabeth Harper. She had worked in the palace for less than 3 months. She was quiet, honest, and almost invisible to everyone around her. No one expected the queen to ask for her. Late that evening, a royal guard appeared outside the servants' quarters. He looked directly at Elizabeth. "The queen wishes to see you." Immediately, the other servants stared at her in complete surprise. Elizabeth had never spoken to the queen before. Her hands trembled as she followed the guard through the endless corridors. The palace felt strangely empty. Every candle flickered as if the building itself was holding its breath. When she reached the royal chamber, the guard slowly opened the heavy wooden door. The room was warm and filled with the scent of old books and burning candles. The queen sat alone beside the fireplace, wrapped in a white blanket. She looked weak, but her eyes were sharp and full of determination. She dismissed everyone else from the room. The door closed behind Elizabeth. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Then the queen slowly reached beneath her chair and removed a small wooden box. It was covered with faded velvet and locked with a tiny golden key. The queen placed the box into Elizabeth's hands. It felt surprisingly heavy. "Listen carefully," the queen whispered. "I have trusted powerful men all my life. Today I trust only you." Elizabeth could hardly breathe. "Your Majesty, I do not understand." The queen smiled sadly. "You do not need to understand tonight. You only need to remember." She placed a delicate golden key into Elizabeth's palm. "Never allow anyone to open the 7th room. No matter who gives the order. No matter what they promise. Protect it until your final breath." Elizabeth looked confused. She had worked inside the palace every day. She knew every hallway, every staircase, and every wing. There was no 7th room. "Your Majesty, where is the 7th room?" The queen slowly looked toward the fireplace. "Hidden where only the faithful can find it." Before Elizabeth could ask another question, loud footsteps echoed outside the chamber. Several royal advisors entered the room. The queen immediately fell silent. Her face became calm once again. She looked at Elizabeth one final time. "Remember your promise." Elizabeth bowed her head. "I promise." The next morning, church bells rang across the country. The queen was dead. The entire nation entered mourning. Black flags appeared across the palace. Visitors arrived from every corner of Britain. The palace became crowded with official soldiers and members of the royal family. Within hours, the queen's private rooms were ordered to be searched. Every document, every diary, and every personal possession was carefully examined. Elizabeth watched silently from the corridor. She kept the small wooden box hidden beneath her coat. No one knew it existed. Late that evening, she overheard 2 senior advisors speaking behind a closed door. "Search every chamber, every passage, every hidden room. Find the 7th room before anyone else does." Elizabeth felt her heart stop. How could they know about a room that did not exist? Or did it exist after all? She returned to her small room and carefully opened the wooden box for the very first time. Inside rested only one folded piece of paper. She slowly unfolded it. The message contained just a single sentence. "When the ravens leave the tower, the door will finally appear." Elizabeth stared at the words in complete silence. She had no idea what they meant. But deep inside she knew one thing. The queen had not given her a treasure. She had given her a secret that powerful people had been searching for long before her final night. And somewhere inside the palace, a hidden room was waiting to be found. Elizabeth did not sleep that night. She read the mysterious note over and over until the first light of dawn entered her small room. The words refused to leave her mind. "When the ravens leave the tower, the door will finally appear." The palace was now filled with soldiers, royal advisors, and servants preparing for the Queen's funeral. Every corridor echoed with hurried footsteps. Everyone seemed to be searching for something. But no one dared to say what it was. Elizabeth hid the wooden box beneath a loose floorboard in her room and carried the golden key inside a small cloth pouch around her neck. She trusted no one. Not even the people who had worked beside her for months. Later that afternoon she was ordered to clean the Queen's private library. It was the last room that had not yet been emptied. The moment she stepped inside she felt an unusual silence. Rows of ancient books covered every wall. A large fireplace stood in the center of the room. Above it hung a portrait of the Queen painted many years earlier. Elizabeth remembered something. On the Queen's final night, she had looked toward the fireplace before speaking about the seventh room. Elizabeth slowly walked toward it. She examined every stone, every carving, and every piece of wood. Nothing seemed unusual. As she turned away, her hand accidentally touched a small bronze raven carved into the edge of the fireplace. It moved. A soft clicking sound echoed through the room. Elizabeth stepped back in surprise. Part of the bookshelf beside the fireplace slowly shifted a few inches before stopping. Hidden behind it was a narrow passage covered in dust. No one had entered it for many years. Her heart raced. She picked up a candle and stepped inside. The air was cold. The walls were lined with faded portraits of women whose names had been scratched away. At the end of the passage stood an old wooden door. There was no number on it. Only the image of a single raven carved into the center. Elizabeth reached into her pocket and removed the golden key. It fit perfectly. The lock turned with a deep metallic sound. Slowly the door opened. Inside was a small circular room unlike anything she had ever seen. There were no jewels, no gold, no royal treasures. Instead, the room was filled with shelves holding hundreds of handwritten letters, leather journals, and carefully wrapped portraits. Every item carried the royal seal. In the center of the room stood a stone table. Upon it rested a leather journal with a note written in the Queen's own handwriting. For the one who kept her promise. Elizabeth carefully opened the journal. The first page made her hands tremble. History remembers kings. But kingdoms are often saved by women whose names are never written down. Before she could read another line, she heard footsteps in the hidden passage. Someone else had found the entrance. A man's voice echoed through the darkness. You opened the room. Exactly as she knew you would. Elizabeth quickly closed the journal. She blew out her candle and waited in complete silence. As the footsteps came closer, she realized she was no longer the only person who knew the Queen's final secret. The footsteps stopped just outside the hidden chamber. Elizabeth held her breath. The only sound she could hear was the steady beating of her own heart. The stranger did not enter immediately. Instead, he spoke in a calm voice that echoed through the narrow passage. You do not need to be afraid. If Her Majesty chose you, then I am not your enemy. Elizabeth remained silent. She remembered the Queen's final warning. Trust no one. Slowly she picked up a heavy brass candle holder from the stone table and stood beside the door. The stranger finally stepped inside. He was an elderly man dressed in a simple black coat rather than a royal uniform. His silver hair and tired eyes suggested he had served the palace for many years. When he saw Elizabeth protecting the journal, he smiled gently. Good. She chose wisely. Elizabeth did not lower the candle holder. Who are you? The man bowed respectfully. My name is Samuel Ashcroft. For 30 years I was the Queen's personal archivist. I protected the records that no one else was allowed to see. Elizabeth studied his face carefully. If that is true, then why did the Queen never mention you? Samuel looked around the hidden room. Because even walls can listen. The fewer names she spoke, the safer we all remained. He slowly pointed toward the shelves surrounding them. Everything you see here was hidden from history. Not because it was shameful, but because revealing it at the wrong time could have destroyed innocent lives. Elizabeth looked at the hundreds of letters. Who wrote all of these? Women. Samuel answered quietly. Queens. princesses, ladies in waiting, nurses, servants, mothers, women who changed the course of history without ever receiving credit. The world remembers the kings. But these women carried the kingdom through its darkest days. Elizabeth slowly opened the journal again. Each page contained a different story. One described a young nurse who secretly carried messages during wartime to prevent a rebellion. Another told of a palace maid who uncovered a plot to poison members of the royal household. There were stories of women who gave up titles, fortunes, and even their own freedom to protect others. None of their names appeared in official history. Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes. Why would anyone hide this? Samuel sighed deeply. Because powerful people often prefer simple stories. They wanted history to belong to rulers, not to ordinary women whose courage quietly changed everything. Before Elizabeth could answer, the sound of boots echoed through the palace above them. This time there were many voices. Samuel's expression became serious. They are searching every room. Someone has told them about the hidden passage. Elizabeth quickly closed the journal. Who are they? Samuel walked toward one of the shelves and removed a small wooden case. Inside lay dozens of sealed letters tied together with a blue ribbon. The Queen expected this day would come. These letters contain the truth. If they are destroyed, the stories of these women will disappear forever. Elizabeth took the bundle carefully. What do we do now? Samuel looked directly into her eyes. We leave the palace tonight. There is only one place left where these stories will be safe. Before either of them could move, a loud crash echoed from the entrance of the hidden passage. The stone doorway shook violently. Someone was forcing their way inside. A deep, commanding voice called out through the darkness. In the name of the crown, open this door immediately. Samuel extinguished the final candle. The hidden chamber disappeared into complete darkness. Then he whispered, "The Queen prepared you for this moment. Now your real journey begins." Darkness filled the hidden chamber. Elizabeth could hear the heavy blows against the stone door growing louder with every passing second. Dust fell from the ceiling as the ancient entrance began to crack. Samuel leaned close and whispered, "There is another way out. Very few people know it exists." He picked up a small oil lantern and led Elizabeth to the back of the chamber. Behind one of the wooden shelves he pressed a loose stone into the wall. A narrow passage slowly opened. Cold air rushed inside. "Quickly," Samuel said. "We have only minutes." Elizabeth held the bundle of letters tightly against her chest and followed him into the tunnel. The passage twisted beneath the palace for what felt like forever. The walls were lined with old bricks blackened by time. On several stones Elizabeth noticed the same symbol carved again and again. A single white rose. "What does that mean?" she asked. Samuel smiled sadly. It was the Queen's private symbol. Whenever she wanted to protect someone without anyone knowing, she marked the place with a white rose. The tunnel finally ended beneath an abandoned chapel hidden inside the palace gardens. Moonlight poured through the broken stained glass windows. Snow covered the old stone floor. The chapel had clearly been forgotten for many years. Samuel walked to the altar and carefully lifted a loose stone. Beneath it was a small iron box. Inside were several passports, old maps, a pouch of gold coins, and another sealed letter. The Queen planned everything, Elizabeth whispered. Samuel nodded. She knew powerful people would search the palace after her death. She wanted the stories to survive even if she did not. Elizabeth looked at the final sealed envelope. Across the front were written only 6 words. "Open only when hope is lost." Before she could ask another question, a distant bell rang across the palace grounds. Samuel looked toward the chapel door. "They have discovered the tunnel. We must leave now." The two of them crossed the silent gardens under the cover of darkness. Snow fell gently around them. In the distance, the palace glowed beneath hundreds of lights as guards searched every corner of the grounds. Just as they reached the old iron gate leading into the forest, a voice called from behind, "Elizabeth, do not take another step." She turned slowly. Standing beneath the moonlight was Lord Edward Blackwood, one of the Queen's most trusted royal advisers. Several armed guards stood beside him. Lord Blackwood looked calm, almost friendly. "You have something that belongs to the crown. Give me the letters, and I promise no one will be harmed." Samuel quietly stepped in front of Elizabeth. "You made the Queen fear her own court." Lord Blackwood smiled. "History is not written by truth. It is written by those who survive." He raised his hand. The guards slowly surrounded them. Elizabeth looked down at the bundle of letters. She suddenly understood why the Queen had protected them for so many years. These were not just old papers. They were the forgotten voices of women who had shaped a kingdom. And someone was willing to silence them forever. The cold wind swept across the palace gardens as Elizabeth stood surrounded by Lord Blackwood and his guards. Snow fell silently around them. For a long moment no one moved. Lord Blackwood looked at Elizabeth with calm confidence. "You are very young. You do not understand what you are carrying. Give me the letters. Walk away, and you can live a peaceful life." Elizabeth tightened her grip on the leather bundle. "The Queen trusted me. I will not betray her." Lord Blackwood sighed. "That is exactly what I expected you to say." He raised one hand. The guards slowly stepped forward. Before they could reach Elizabeth, a church bell rang loudly across the city. The sound echoed through the frozen night. Samuel quietly leaned toward Elizabeth. "When I say run, do not stop. No matter what happens." Elizabeth looked at him. "What about you?" Samuel smiled. "Someone must stay behind." The Queen knew this day would come. She prepared both of us for different duties. Suddenly Samuel threw the old lantern onto the snowy ground. The glass shattered. Flames burst upward. The frightened horses pulling the royal carriages panicked and raced through the courtyard. Guards shouted in confusion. Smoke filled the entrance. "Run!" Samuel shouted. Elizabeth ran as fast as she could through the narrow streets beyond the palace walls. She never looked back. Hours later she reached a small stone church hidden deep in the countryside. The priest waiting inside greeted her without surprise. "We have been expecting you." Elizabeth stared at him. "You knew I was coming." The priest nodded. "The Queen visited this church many years ago. She asked us to protect the truth if the palace ever became unsafe." He led Elizabeth into a quiet room beneath the church. There stood an ancient wooden table. On it rested a single sealed envelope tied with a white ribbon. Across the front were written the words, "For the guardian who keeps her promise." Elizabeth carefully broke the seal. Inside was the Queen's final letter. She began to read. "If these words have reached you, then I am no longer alive, and those who fear the truth have already begun their search. Do not believe they seek power alone. They seek silence. For centuries brave women have protected this kingdom without asking for crowns, titles, or statues. They healed the wounded, prevented wars, saved innocent lives, and carried burdens that history chose to forget. I created the seventh room so their voices would never disappear. Not because they were queens, but because they were courageous. If one day the world becomes ready, let these stories be told. Not to shame the past, but to honor those who were never thanked." Elizabeth slowly lowered the letter. Tears filled her eyes. She finally understood the true purpose of the seventh room. It had never been built to hide treasure. It had been built to protect forgotten women. The priest quietly placed another object on the table. It was a beautifully carved wooden box. Inside rested dozens of small journals. Each carried the name of a different woman. Each contained a story that history had never recorded. Elizabeth looked toward the church window as the first light of morning appeared across the snowy hills. She whispered to herself, "Their stories will never be forgotten again." At that very moment the church doors opened. A young messenger rushed inside breathing heavily. He looked directly at Elizabeth. "They found Samuel. And Lord Blackwood is coming here. He knows you have the Queen's final letter." The church fell silent. No one spoke. The only sound was the wind moving through the ancient stone walls. Elizabeth carefully folded the Queen's final letter and placed it back inside the wooden box. She looked at the priest. "How much time do we have?" "Only a few minutes." The priest answered quietly. "Lord Blackwood will be here before sunrise." Elizabeth closed her eyes for a moment. She remembered the Queen's final words. Protect their stories. Not because they belonged to royalty, but because they belonged to brave women. She opened her eyes with a calm determination she had never felt before. "We are not running anymore." The priest looked surprised. "Then what will we do?" Elizabeth smiled gently. "We will make sure these stories survive. Even if I do not." Together they carried the journals into the church library. Behind one of the oldest bookshelves was a hidden stone vault. Inside were hundreds of handwritten books collected over generations. Elizabeth carefully placed every journal beside them. She added the Queen's final letter at the very top. Then she locked the vault with the golden key. Moments later the church doors burst open. Lord Blackwood entered with several guards. His eyes immediately searched the room. "Where are the journals?" Elizabeth stood calmly before him. "You are too late." He stepped closer. "Tell me where they are." "History belongs to those who protect the crown." Elizabeth looked directly into his eyes. "No. History belongs to those who lived it. Whether they wore a crown, or an apron, whether they ruled a kingdom, or quietly saved one." For the first time Lord Blackwood had no answer. He searched every room, every shelf, every corner of the church. But the hidden vault remained undiscovered. Days later Samuel recovered from his injuries and quietly joined Elizabeth at the small countryside church. Together they made a promise. Every year another forgotten story would be copied and placed inside libraries, churches, and private collections across Britain. Not as royal secrets, but as the lives of extraordinary women who deserved to be remembered. Many years passed. Elizabeth grew old. She never married. She never sought fame. She devoted her entire life to preserving the stories hidden inside the seventh room. On the final evening of her life she sat beside the same wooden box the Queen had placed into her hands so many years before. She wrote one last letter. "If you have found these pages, then history has chosen a new guardian. Do not search for crowns. Search for courage. Because the greatest heroes are often the people whose names were never written in history books." She smiled as she sealed the letter. Outside the church bells began to ring. The first light of dawn filled the room. Elizabeth quietly closed her eyes for the last time. Years later a young historian discovered the hidden vault beneath the old church. Inside were hundreds of journals, each telling the true story of a woman whose bravery had helped shape a nation. The collection became known as the Seventh Room Chronicles, not because it revealed the greatest royal treasure, but because it revealed something far more valuable: the forgotten courage of ordinary women. And from that day forward, their voices were never silent again.